Hello everyone, welcome to the world of English language and literature. In continuation with the previous lecture, we begin with looking at the Middle English period, and we begin with the understanding that the Middle English period cannot be constructed in a single seamless continual. It means we need to divide at least into two parts, before Chaucer and the period after Chaucer. It has a subtitle English before Chaucer. So we begin with the inherent understanding that Chaucer is perhaps the most determinant figure in classifying Middle English into two, and also perhaps the most important literary figure and cultural figure in the whole of Middle English period. However, in today's class, we look at the period before Chaucer, trying to locate the Middle English period in a more holistic sense, looking at the other literary influences which began to shape Middle English language and Middle English literature even before the arrival of Chaucer. So, which is this period we classified as Middle English? There is no exact date or year in which the Anglo-Saxon period or Old English period came to an end and the Middle English period began. But however, for political convenience, it's easier to note down 1066, the year of Norman conquest, is the beginning of Middle English period, because politically that was a time the Anglo-Saxon dominance came to be an end and the Normans too took over England. Around the same time, significant changes came to be imparted into English language as well. And in that sense, 1066 is the one convenient date which can mark the inaugural moment of Middle English period. And the language which can see during this Middle English period is not Old English. It's not the modern contemporary language either. It's a form of a blend Old English and Norman English. And in that sense, historians even call the language of this period as in-between language. But English during this period became more comprehensible, and the literature of this period is easier to identify with that Old English text. And in today's section, we will be looking only at the period till the beginning of Chaucer. And it's more important to be stated that historians consider Chaucer is the real starting point of English literature. So in some sense, the works have been talked about in today's lecture, they are not in supreme importance in terms of literary analysis or literary criticism, and they only have a historical kind of interest in situating the events that led them to the emergence of Chaucer as the most important literary figure. With this understanding, we move on to the major milestone to the Middle English period. 1066 is obviously the Norman conquest, and by 1215 we have the very politically defining moment which produced the Magna Carta, about which we will be hearing a little more after shortly. And around 1250, the French begins to lose its prominence to the various other socio-political events. Some of it will be looking at the later sessions, and it also characterized by the 100 Years' War, which lasted from 1337 to 1453. The details which we should be taking a look when we talk about Chaucer's England. And 1362 is marked as a very important year in terms of the prominence that the English language acquired. It is here the Statute of Pleading which ordered that the henceforth all proceedings in the law court should be in English instead of French. The period is also characterized by the Black Death, the Vivannic Pledge, which affected not just Britain but also many parts of Europe. And this is also significant era which saw the emergence of the middle class as very prominent figure. And it's supposedly not that Europe is also undergoing a radical changes during the Middle English period, and this was a time Holy Crusade as well. But we do find that England had participated only minimally in the Holy Crusade. But however, the literature of this time the literature of love, the literature of belonging, the literature of love about the beloved who is left behind, who's is yearning for the soldier who is out at war front. All these kinds of themes are built into the literature of the time because of the influence of Holy Crusade as well. It was also politically and religiously quite significant. It should be also highlighted the point that around this period, England also outgrows the hostility between the native and the invaders, who were the Norman and the French. And in 1066, when the Norman and the French were invaded Anglo-Saxon, there was a growing hostility for a quite long time. But the end of middle class period, we find that it's no longer about further influences. It's no longer about fighting among themselves, but it's more about consolidating themselves as a nation and as a single linguistic unit. And let's take a quick look at what are the event is Magna Carta. This is important because it was a very politically significant event that began to mark the ways in which England began to shape itself as a nation, and also even at a later point of time when England was talking about the rights in the various ways in which it could negotiate between the rulers, and the ruled Magna Carta was a very determining factor. So this was the Great Charter of the Liberty, as many of us known about, and this was signed on 15 June 1215. It was crafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury and was agreed by the King John, was the ruler of England then. And this is in fact as the result of the upgrowing rebellion from the barons and the Swisses, who are signed to make peace between highly unpopular King John and the group of rebel barons. So in that sense, it was one of the earliest political negotiation that had taken place. And this also had a lot of implication for the commoners because it's promised for the protection of church rights, and it also involved the protection of barons from illegal imprisonment, and it also ensured that the king could not act according to his aims and fancies, but he also had to put in play certain principles in certain rights revealable to the subjects to the other rulers of the time. And Magna Carta is supremely important, and we choose to discuss this lecture because it became a part of English political life, and we began to see that the literature of the time also reflect this kind of new freedom and new secular ambience which was getting generated in England, and Magna Carta was incidentally renewed by each monarch who one after the other, and in that sense it assumes supreme political and civil importance. Now coming back to our main topic in Middle English literature. Middle English literature a little more varies when compared to the Old English literature. We know that the Old English literature is more about war and religion and about trials of daily life, but with the Middle English period we move a little ahead. It certainly the whole literature occupies a major part of literary writings. We find a new kind of literature emerging which could be classified as romances. We need to understand romance in a broad sense, not just about love literature. It also about knights and their quest for courtly love and the values of chivalry. And in that sense, the romance literature is mostly about the lives of knights and kind of adventure that they embarked upon. So the romance have not yet reduced the love life between just two ordinary people. So we also find that the local traditional song and ballads were emerging. We don't have much evidences about the kind of songs and ballads that existed during this time, and it's mostly transmitted through oral tradition. And it also difficult to date these ballads to the same reason. Some are even of the opinion that these ballads were prominently even during the Old English period, which transmitted through oral to one generation to the another one. And some of the important and notable ballads were orally transmitted even after the Middle English period, which later came to be known as the Song of Lord Randall, and some songs celebrated the changing of the season. So, in this lecture, we are not discussing much about the oral tradition of the songs and ballads. We should be focusing mostly on war literature, religious literature, and the romances in during that time. And another significant factor is that the most of the works were anonymous. It is not quite common how to sign the work with their own name, and in that sense, no one took any kinds of ownership to the work. All literary works are considered as public property, and books were very expensive at that time. And printing had not yet come into place, and it was mostly copied. Manuscripts were also available, and it was also very expensive, and not many could afford it. London also emerges as a center of politic center of trade, commerce, and also culture and writing. And we also notice that most of the prominent writers were living in London, and it was also because London was the Norman capital to the Norman conquest. So, in that sense, London was the more happening than the other parts of the country. Many chose to invade to London, and they continued to build a more literary career over there. And it was also the time when Oxford and Cambridge began to be founded, and the emergence of major center of culture and language. And Oxford was founded in 1167 and Cambridge in 1209. And we begin to notice that these cultural activities and these foundations were begin to be founded as early as Middle English period. Let's now look at the various kinds of writings which were available during this period. We note that even when we take an entire century in head, we have a couple of works how to be talk about worthwhile. In 12th century, we have two major works, Aumulam and the Owl and the Nightingale. The work Aumulam, it was very religious in nature. It will be translated as an interpretation of the Bible, and it was also significant in a historical sense. It traces the history of the English people from the Roman conquest onwards, and in that sense, it also goes through glimpses of local life and transition from the one ruler to the other. And with this, the historians look at these work with a lot of interest. It also one of the earliest work which used poetic meter. And the other work, Owl and the Nightingale, are structured in a quite innovative way. It included arguments between philosophical nature, things in daily life, and even about more profound things related to the life in general. The arguments were in this structure were courtly style, so it was more allegorical than many of the other works of that period. So apart from these two major works, we do not have any evidence for the other kinds of literature that flourished during this period, apart from the oral literature of that period. In 13th century, we also notice that the literary output began to look at more productive and a little bit more productive than before century. Lymon's Brut, which is written in 1205, it perhaps the most important work rather than the later work that came after the period of Chaucer. This work is not purely literary in nature, it's a historiography of Britain in the form of a poem. And it also draws attention to the fact that even history could be written in verse during that time, because verse is easier for people to memorize. It also gave them a way to make oral transmission easier. So verse do not have the limitation that we now talk about, because nowadays we know that any kind of historiography to be written in verse to be quite in an unpickable feat. In that sense, Lymon's Brut could be considered as very significant work which could blend in together elements of history and elements of poetry together. This is also the work in which we find the first appearance of King Arthur. We notice in one of the previous lecture that the legends of King Arthur is what made him more popular than the historical evidence of his own existence. We also find that Lymon's Brut tried to think all the historical with modern English. Many historians have talked about Lymon's Brute as the first voice in Middle English, especially in terms of language, because in this work we find that the use of English language is less conscious, it's more colloquial, and it's more use of idioms and proverbs. In that sense, more familiarity of the language found from Lymon's Brute onwards. Another important work of the time is Wave's Arthurian Chronicles. King Arthur of the Old English time, he assumed supreme importance during this period because we find them getting distracted from all other kinds of randoms of history. We can also find that the popularization of Arthurian tale not just from England but also from France. We find a lot of French ballads, French folk tales talking about King Arthur, and many English writers also well known for their writings in English, and two romances are also well known, King Home and Herberg the Dane. The authors are unknown. And the Roman de la Rose, or the Romance of the Rose, is considered as the most influential text of Middle English period, and this was written in French. This is said to have a profound influence on the writings during 15th century. It is also a foundation of writing of romance to develop later in the 14th and 15th century as well. Another important figure in the Middle English period is Geoffrey of Monmouth. He said have lived around 1100 1155, and most important notable work of Geoffrey, The History of the King of Britain. It was highly popular, and most historians rely on this work for getting glimpse of the past cultural and social religious aspects of life. It's he who popularized the legends of King Arthur. So Geoffrey of Monmouth, he is the one who popularized the legend of King Arthur. He lives through the legend recreated by Geoffrey of Monmouth. In fact, many of the things is attributed to King Arthur through the works of Geoffrey of Monmouth. And other notable figure is that Robert Manning of Brown. He was also a monk and chronicler. He was also a part of canon during this period. There are two notable works, Handling's Inn and Manning's Chronicle. Handling's Inn is considered to be the first confessional manual in English, and Manning's Chronicle is yet another work based on history, and again this is the story of England written in verse, and it is said that it's extending through the reign of Edward I. It's a translation of Old English text. In his work, he can find a lot of biographical information about himself, and this is quite surprising because many writers may not use personal matters in writings, and many writers may not even sign with their own name after the work. In that sense, Manning shows commendable insight in talking about himself and about his own surroundings of the time. In the 14th century, we are more closing about the life of Chaucer. This is the period which is known as the period of the alliterative revival. Alliterate revival, as the term signifies, it's a resurgence of poetry with particular kinds of alliteration and rhymes built into it. And do not find England going back from this period onwards. We can find that an increased interest and attention to poetry and other forms of literature. This is also the time when England prepared itself to produce greater classics to get more attention and interest of the classic of Greek and Latin. And the notable features of the time is that the presence of particular anonymous poet who was come to be known as the Pearl poet, the Governed poet, based on a set of poems known as the Pearl poems, or based on the major work known as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. This is also the best known Arthurian tale from the Middle English time, and the Pearl poet and the Gawain poet, he is also said to be the contemporary of Chaucer, Gower and Langland. This century is more important because a sense of literature, a sense of national unity is getting immense in the period of literature. We are getting access to all these Old English and Middle English texts. Perhaps one should be very thankful to this major figure, Robert Cotton, and most of his work are talked about whether it's an Old English text, Beowulf, or Middle English text like Gawain and the Green Knight. All these manuscripts became acceptable because they are present in the particular manuscript set known as Cotton Nero AX, and this was from a personal collection of Robert Bruce Cotton, and he was a quite successful, wealthy person who lived in later 10th and early 17th century. He showed great interest in local history and he was a noted antiquarian of the time, and we find that he has collecting most of the Old English and Middle English manuscripts which were available, and he is said to have predicted how preserved they did not go extant in any way. In fact, about his manuscripts, historians feel that his collection outshone those of the crown, the church, and the inns of the court. It's very important, we have noted earlier, most of the manuscripts literary collection was available either with the court or with the church. The monastery were the charge of the most of the times, or it was with the inns of the court, which primarily compared to the four institutions which together constitute a judiciary of those times. So Robert Cotton has said to be have had a collection which outshone all these collections put together, and one should be thankful to Robert Cotton for going these kinds of passion to preserve these extant texts. And he granted every collection to the British Library where it's preserved. In many sense, the Middle English period and the Old English period is important not just because of the expert of the people who lived during this period, but also because of the sense of rational heritage is giving more important. Robert Cotton contributed a lot in many different ways than anyone. Coming back to the linguistic aspects, there were four major dialects during this time: Southwestern, which have emerged from the Old English West Saxon; Southwestern, which emerged from the Old English Kentish; East Midland and West Midland, and also Northern. So all these dialects were in some form a continuation from the Old English dialect. We also know that the two dialects, East Midland and West Midland, they have together emerged from the Old English Mercian, and in the context, East Midland assumes most important because it's later became Chaucer's language. And since East Midland spoke more in London and also became the major literary vehicle of Chaucer, East Midland is the one from which the most contemporary English said to have emerged, and this is also known as a kind of northern dialect. And we find that almost all these dialects are different from each other. These dialects were always like 5 different languages. West Midland is the most accepted language because it's the most spoken language in London, and also it's the language of Chaucer. In terms of dialects differences, England begins to assert itself as a single nation linguistic identity. This diversity does not affect in any way the function of language or the emergence of English language into a single unit. England begins to affirm its own kind of literature even though it has a lot of influence from the neighbor country. That makes the country the more distinguishedly in many ways. This literary output and language, Middle English time, is getting consolidated towards the end of Middle English period. And the advent of Chaucer also, Anglo-Saxon language is almost like a dead foreign language now. So let's wind up this session by giving a brief prelude to the next section, which going to the age of Chaucer. Many historians feel that Chaucer is the real starting point of English literature. And so whatever we discussed in today's literature is completely overshadowed by the presence of Chaucer. And with the advent of Chaucer, many historians considered himself as the father of English poetry and genuinely considered as the opening moment of English literature. We are come to end of this session. We found that how Old English and Middle English period are most important and significant in shaping laying the foundation of English literature. So we look forward to see you in the next session. Till then, bye bye.